We're going to have a bridging moment here. So that was the last of our plenary sessions, our last of our plenary panel. So I want to thank that group of leaders in particular for helping to set the stage for the commission in our second phase. And how do we go beyond our initial set of recommendations that we developed in 2020 and then through 2022. We're going to spend late morning, early afternoon back in your working group sessions, but to provide some further inspiration, perhaps some provocation, we're going to have 4 lightning round quick talks, innovation spotlights, to challenge us, to help us think differently about some innovation potential, some challenges, and opportunities. Our first presenter is Dr. Tom Campbell. Tom is the co-director of LEAP Manufacturing. He's also a senior fellow at the Council on Competitiveness, a long distinguished career in the government as well as in the private sector and academia. Tom, stage is yours.
There you go. Awesome. Here's the clicker. Excellent. So, thanks so much, Chad and Deborah, and thanks to UC Davis for the incredible hospitality this week also. It's been a real thrill to see many colleagues I've known for many years and meet many people for the first time this week as well. So, as Chad mentioned, I'm with a group called LEAP Manufacturing, which is actually a national consortium of battery manufacturers, both public-private partnership we're developing. And so when Chad asked me, Tom, talk about the future of disruptive technology, I get this request frequently, and I think, wow, that is a massive topic. How do I even scope that? And so I thought, well, one of the things, what is the most critical thing right now that I feel in a somewhat panoptic view that I've been fortunate enough to have within my career about technologies? And I decided supply chains is the biggest issue. And I hope to convince everyone in the audience that this may be the very biggest issue in our country right now that cuts across all technologies. So the U.S. has been fantastic at inventing technologies. I myself have been in research labs. I've developed research labs. I've been in industry. I've been in academia. And we've developed and patented many great technologies over the last several decades. I list several examples here: semiconductors, biotech, 3D printing. Those not familiar with 3D printing, I used to do core research in this area way back before CNN and everybody even knew what the heck it was. For example, in 3D printing, we invented metals 3D printing. The patents then expired, and they went pretty much all the manufacturing went to Europe and Asia. So we are really good at doing this sort of thing, but then we let it slide. And that's very unfortunate for our economy, for our national security, and everything involved in technologies, because we then become dependent upon other states. And one of the things we have seen is that China is rearing its head immensely in all these technology sectors. And I would even posit they are now a fierce competitor in all these other areas I list here. Of course, there could be other spaces, such as hypersonics and other things, but I'm just trying to scope it a little bit herein. And I can attest to this with some level of credibility. My background, Chad mentioned briefly, I was a senior in the U.S. government. I was actually a senior in the Office of Director of National Intelligence as the senior-most analyst in all of the intelligence community for an amazing 3 years at the closing end of the Obama administration, beginning of the Trump administration. And in that context, on the next slide, I'm going to show a slide that has quite a few words, but I'm going to sort of tee it up here first. I was fortunate to be able to write what's called the Annual Threat Assessment. And so the Annual Threat Assessment, for those of you who are not familiar with it, you should absolutely read it. There is an unclassified version that is published every year. It was published last February. There's also a classified version, which, trust me, is a lot more interesting. It's a lot longer, but you cannot access it unless you have clearances. And so in the ATA, they oftentimes, what they do is they attempt to assess the holistic view of technologies and what are the big, and geopolitics and other many things, and what are the biggest threats. And I was fascinating to see that this year they called out China very prominently. I was actually surprised in the first, I think, 15 pages of the unclassed version, it was all China. And this is kind of unprecedented. I mean, there's always been sections about China and whatnot, but I pulled out one quote which I think would resonate with many people in the audience, particularly those of you from industry and national labs and so forth. basically, China is central to the global supply chains in a range of tech, and I list all the ones here. Xi has noted his intentions to increase the global supply chain dependencies on China with the aim of controlling the key supply chains and being able to increase these dependencies to threaten and cut off foreign countries during a crisis, aka the United States, Europe, and our allies. So this dominance could pose a significant risk to U.S. interests overall. And I must emphasize that every single word in this ATA, like every intelligence community product, is very carefully debated. So there are 17 intelligence community agencies. The Office of Director of National Intelligence has the opportunity to help adjudicate amongst all of them. And I can attest that when you go through a full-blown review and get something published outside of the community, you have to have every word agreed upon. And it's a lot of emails back and forth, and it's a lot of, shall we say, fun, and collaborating with all the agencies and so forth. But so this is the definitive statement from the intelligence community, the folks that protect us every day, including the Department of Defense. So we should all pay attention to this. And so in this context, I list here, I show a couple graphics of different technologies, and you may not be familiar with all of these, so I'm going to just rip through a couple random statistics about some of these things. So first and foremost, robotics and automation. Japan, South Korea are the leaders in use of robotics and automation overall. China happens to be the biggest producer of robotics and automation systems in general. So, for example, my colleagues in Texas, when the Tesla Gigafactory was being built, they told me, hey, Tom, we saw hundreds of planes flying in from China with all the equipment. So Tesla Gigafactory actually has those Chinese robotics in it because guess what? They couldn't buy those robots in the United States. The periodic table, for those material scientist geeks like myself, you look at that and you think, well, okay, raw materials. Well, actually, raw materials, we heard last panel about rare earth minerals and materials, fundamental elements. The vast majority are processed and mined and or processed in China. So, for example, the vast majority of lithium in batteries. On the next little graphic there, 80% of the batteries themselves that we use in all our phones, all our screens, our devices are made in China. And given the forecast, that is not going to be changing anytime soon. The semiconductor chips, we're all familiar with Semicon. The Chips and Science Act was a shout out to the country, hey, we really need to do something about that to reshore the supply chain of semiconductors, because guess what? 92% of the advanced chips, the ones that go in our most advanced products, are made in Taiwan by TSMC. One of my biggest fears, and my national security community colleagues share this fear with me, is God forbid Taiwan becomes invaded by China. And I'll throw that out there, and there are people in the communities that I work with, the national security community, who basically forecast anywhere from 2 to 5 years. It's essentially inevitable because President Xi really, really wants Taiwan. They consider it their home land. And so if that were to happen, I mean, all gloves are off in terms of supply chain. It may end up being World War III, God forbid. So we need to keep abreast of that. And essentially, we have almost a few years window to try and reshore a lot of these things. The last point I want to make about biotechnology, you see the DNA strand therein. Don't know if you're familiar with the space of the biopharma community, but 40 to 80%, depending upon how you look at it, of the active pharmaceutical ingredients in all of our drugs are made in China. So all the antibiotics that we may use if we get sick, all the other things we take on a daily basis if we have any kind of chronic disease, those things, the fundamental ingredients that make the kernel of those drugs are made in China. And so we are very, very dependent, unfortunately, on folks we might consider our foreign adversaries to ourselves. So I would posit supply chains could be considered, and I use these language, it's kind of the analytic tradecraft could be considered, not absolutely and so forth, but the most impactful issue today in developing and deploying disruptive technologies. Because if you're making a supercomputer, if you're trying to produce a new drug, if you're trying to make an EV, we are all wholly dependent upon other countries for those things. And the other issues we get into, the multidimensionality of the supply chain. Well, you think, oh, well, it's just ships and trains, Tom, who really cares? They'll keep coming to us. No. It's actually a multidimensional, multivariate problem, which is kind of cool from a simulations perspective, and we may be soon looking to model this, and it's all this facets. geopolitical risks, and goes all the way down. I'm not going to read them all, but a couple things. When the Suez Canal got clogged up by that one boat, that blocked shipping lanes. I think it was something on the order of 30 or 40% of shipping for about a couple weeks. And they were trying to dig out the boat and everything. That was one minor thing. The pandemic obviously put a whole lot of wrenches into the works about everything. But local disease outbreaks, regulatory, climate change coming back. So we see a lot more hurricanes and other types of things. So this is all one ball of wax of things that can affect supply chains. And I would posit we're not really doing a whole lot to look at this. I talked to my colleagues in the Department of Defense, which is pouring money out right now to try and desperately reshore the things that they need to defend our country. They don't know how they're going to get all this stuff. There was a New York Times article just a couple days ago in which they said the nuts and bolts, the most simple things you can imagine in mechanical engineering are hard to obtain because of supply chain issues. So my quick recommendations to the council is some considerations to make. Perhaps put a little bit more focus on supply chains. Form a focused working group. I know that it is a subgroup within the technology working group, I believe, at some level. Hold a separate workshop. You might consider this. You can most probably get funding from DoD and multiple agencies because, example, last week I was at the RPE Energy Innovation Summit. One of the topics that was an undercurrent on the tech demo platform was supply chain. I talked to a lot of companies and I asked them, so what do you think about supply chain? And they said, oh, we're kind of in trouble. We don't know where we're going to get the batteries, the raw materials, everything else. Draft a short report. Engage in, and I know the council is fantastic at doing this, in a whole of government approach. That's one of the beautiful things I love working with the council about, is they can convene all the wonderful people here in this audience, as well as back in DC on the Hill and everybody else, to look at this from a panoptic perspective and eventually draw experts from industry and academia because, again, lots of people are super concerned and interested in this. And I will say it again, if, God forbid, Taiwan were to be invaded by China, we have only a few years to do good things in this space. So lastly, create a goal of substantial policy recommendations to mitigate current and anticipate and prepare for future supply chain issues. This issue is not going to go away. Even whatever great policy recommendations we may get laid down, it will not disappear, but we should be more aware of it because I can say that I think it's honestly one of the biggest issues in our country right now for both our national security and economy. And there's my contact information. Anybody happy to chat with you about that, and hopefully that was of some use to all the distinguished audience today. Thanks, guys.
Thanks a million. Deborah and I were whispering on the side all the things we need to do now, but we will take. But it's great, and some of that I think we intuitively all felt, but it was important to, I think, have that laid out in front of all of us, and we'll take that back for sure to our commissioners, and we would love to work with you going forward on developing some of those subgroups, working groups, meetings. So thanks again, Tom. So our next speaker, and I'd like to please welcome Dr. Ali Nat'l Malayari. Ali is the John A. Guthrie Endowed Chair in Banking and Financial Services at the University of Wyoming, and he's going to share a little bit about the future of mass customization.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chad. Is that better? All right. That's okay, I'll stay. And also my thanks to Chancellor May and UC Davis for throwing this fantastic shindig here. And to you all for giving me the opportunity today to talk to you about the mass customization revolution and agile manufacturing. We used to produce the stuff for people that we knew very intimately. We would make perfect things for what they needed. And as such, our production cycles were long and our capacity to serve very low. Industrial production have changed that. We reduced production cycles. We served many people, but we lost in return was that intimate touch and the perfect fit. However, in past few decades, we gained some of that back through mass customization and mass personalization. We can produce near perfect fits and still maintain shorter production cycles and serve many people. This in the background that we used to make great things. We were a things economy, and our creativity was hands-on. However, today, we make big things, big ideas. I apologize for that. We are an idea economy. We do great ideas, and our creativity is digital. Why is this important? As Craig Mopp said, if you can envision an idea like a film, shot by shot, scene by scene, from beginning to the end, if you can do that, then it's worth doing. So what's the movie here? We are in possession of legions, millions of young, brilliant American minds who can create fantastic stuff digitally at a touch of a button. They can react fast to the change in innovation and all of that. But this comes at a cost. They do have challenges. The competition is fierce. The taste and preference changes beyond rapidly. Even if they could recreate the old manufacturing ways, is beyond costly. If they reach across the ocean to access the unfriendly places, the gatekeepers have no respect for intellectual property. The supply chains are stretched, stressed beyond means, and this in the context of a chaotic, volatile world power struggle, and the list goes on and on. So what's the solution? I'll present to you a MaaS, Agile Manufacturing as a Service, which is predicated upon a triangular of digital ideation, compartmentalized manufacturing, and network protection. The vision is very simple. It starts with our brilliant young minds creating these digital creations, the blueprints of which is machine ready, which would then send to prototyping capacity that is used as service, leased. Those prototypes then broken down in pieces that would send to 3D printing capacities that are also used as leased capacity. And all of this encapsulated in a cryptography protected networks that intellectual property, system secrets, process secrets, finance secrets are all inside of it. Is this a crazy idea? Absolutely not. The bits and pieces are already in play. Protolab makes prototyping on demand. Stratasys makes manufacturing on demand. Xometry makes manufacturers, finance, and process management in one place, microcosm of what just suggested. What I am suggesting is just leveraging this up to a system whereby the ideation, the digital ideation is protected by cryptography, then can be sent in a tamper-proof way for prototyping, then can be sent in a peer-to-peer encrypted way for bidding. Those bidders then can use industrial 3D capacities leased to produce things, all the while in real-time, trustless way. The process management and financing is working on the background, and as they sell this in real time, they can assess what the market, what the taste, what the capacity, or any change thereof is needed. Now, how do I came about this? About a decade ago, I fell in love with the idea that demography is the most important thing in life, beyond anything else. Why? Giannakopoulos, the grandson of famed American economist Irving Fisher, who's at Yale, has a seminal paper that shows my ratio, the ratio of middle-aged people, 40 to 50, divided by young people, 20 to 30, determines the fate of a stock market. Why? Because that one measure determines whether you're a pure saver economy or not. If you follow the number of babies born, the birth explosions can enhance your return on a stock investment by more than double. Even Warren Buffett would be jealous of that kind of performance. Now, what was mind-blowing is this. I had a company that I hold it way too short. It's called Intuitive Surgical. They make robotic surgeons. I know what they did. I love the company. Disclaimer, I don't have them anymore. But one thing I never understood is why people are so crazy about them. After all, if something gets nicked, you need the surgeon right there to help. The robots can't do that. So one day, a friend of mine, former OR nurse, I asked her, I said, why is it that they're so crazy about this stuff? She laughed. She said, When you and I went to school, we did a lot of calligraphy, cursive writing of that population. Few of us developed this kind of dexterity. Those were our surgeons. This new generation never done any of that, but they did play video games. They have this dexterity. Of those, we have the new surgeons. In other words, we create our own fate and fortune, who we are, our demography, our capabilities. If our kids are creating this stuff in their mind, then we owe it to them to make sure the future they owe is created, and we can't ignore it, and we can't deny them that future. Now, what I'm basically presenting here is what late Secretary Rumsfeld once said. I can only deal with the stuff that I've given, not the stuff that I wished I had. Thank you.
Ali, thank you for helping us think about creating the future with our National Commission. I now want to call up to the stage our next speaker, Dr. Cooper Rensler. Cooper is Senior Partner at Breakthrough Energy Ventures. He's going to share with us his thoughts around what I think is perhaps one of the most compelling megatrends facing not only our nation, but the world. Cooper, stage is yours. There are multiple clickers. This is a new one, so maybe this will work a little better.
Whirl. Yeah, let's test. What do you think? Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Hey, everybody. First of all, shout out to Chad and his team who work really hard behind the scenes to make this all work. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Let's. First, level setting. I'm all here from the perspective of we're all doing the work together, whether that's local initiative, regional initiative, global initiative, diversity, equity, inclusion, let's go. But I was told by Chad to spend 10 minutes getting your blood boiling, so that's what we're about to try and do. So I'm going to argue that climate change is the mega trend that you're not paying enough attention to, despite you being completely exhausted from hearing about it. It is the single biggest threat to our innovation capacity as a nation and as a society. Why? What is required? What is the context requisite for innovation? We need to have systems and institutions, right? We need to have a flux of talent, ideas, and capital. And you need to be able to think about, believe in the credibility of a future that might even value that innovation. And, well, insert alarmist climate change slide here. You've seen enough, so I'm not going to bore you with it. But let's do a little extrapolation exercise. We spend, 2%? A little less than 2% on R&D right now of GDP. Is that right? Federal, exactly, right? So what happens when we have double-digit % of GDP required just for adaptation alone, the necessary adaptation to just, move Floridians? A potential 30% reduction in growth year over year. Growth, for the economists in the audience, can tell you is kind of the precondition for any assumption of the flux of capital in society. 300 million climate refugees, and I don't know. We just heard from a senior in the in the DOD formerly. I personally worry about the social tipping points more than almost anything else. Food and water insecurity fitting in there, and then of course, the insurance industry's gone because actuarial tables don't work anymore. And I had the pleasure of sitting next to a statistician this morning. Maybe she can help us understand when we talk about these 1.5 degree scenarios that we know we're not going to hit now. Right, a week ago was published. Those are only 2/3 probability of having avoided the disasters that they were claiming that we would be able to avoid, and they don't assume tipping points. So there's your alarmism. Let's move on. The point I want to make here is that we're really bad at thinking about tail risk. When we talk about trying to build and construct, fight entropy for the underlying innovation capacity of the nation and the society, I think that it's really easy to try and just focus on what's right in front of us for the next 4 years. But the tail risk of climate is unbelievable. And it's almost like there's some Hofstadter's law here where even if you take it into account, you're almost still certainly underestimating it. But there's a flip side of this too, which is that I think climate change is also going to be the dominant driver of, as a customer of innovation as well, beyond any historical precedent. Why is that? We've heard, I think yesterday, Paul, you said something like we have 50% of the solution. I agree. I would define this in the context of what is market viable today. So however you want to define the climate problem, GHG, radiative forcing, whatever it is, we probably got about half the solutions we need that are already profitable in the market context. For those solutions, what we really need to worry about is deployment. We need to worry about scale. We need to worry about speed. But what do we do for the rest of the puzzle that we can't yet fix, right? That we can't yet address in a market viable context. I'm a technologist fundamentally. I used to believe in the technology only theory of change. I've evolved beyond that. But technology certainly can be one element of that. Invention, to bring something that formerly wasn't in a market viable condition, like, say, green cement that costs less than traditional cement. That could bring something like cement into the market context. But we also know we're going to need innovations in finance that allow you to actually transact, that allow you to fund and invest across the life cycle of technology. And the reality, though, is even for solutions that work, that are already marketable, we're going to fundamentally need behavior change, and that needs to come from very grounds up perspective. And then this is often ignored in groups like this, but the very thermodynamics of the problem of climate are such that you cannot solve all of this with a profit-driven modality in the absence of internalizing that externality. It is fundamentally an externality. That is the issue. And so if you don't have policy change that allows us to actually bring more and more of the solution space into a market-driven context, we're hosed. So these are the 4 levers, and I would argue that it's innovation within each of these pillars that it's really what's requisite. The problem, of course, gets worse because there's not only the dimension of how much of the problem can we solve, it's how quickly can we get there. Here's some historical energy transitions. This is how long after inception it took for coal, oil, and natural gas to get up to majority of energy supply. It takes on the order of a century. And guess what? Our renewables are following the same trend. There's nothing for us to fundamentally believe that it's going to be different this time unless we do something absolutely vast. Massive innovation and dedication is going to be required in public-private partnership to have any chance at that slope meeting anything like any of those curves from the IPC that you see and say, great, we're on track for 2C, 3C, 4C. So I'll just summarize by saying we need to be thinking about how much of the problem we can address, but we also need to think about how fast we can scale those innovations. So we're going to require innovation at unprecedented pace of scale. And this may sound very depressing. I find myself depressed often. But there's a flip side of this, which is that if we are to do this, it will be the greatest single achievement of our species. It would be a transcendental achievement to have been able to say, we are going to collectively take on the greatest challenge in scaling innovation of all time, and we're going to do it at a global scale and at a pace that's unprecedented. Okay, and then there's also opportunity here for the capitalists in the room, which is that the very industries that are going to be destroyed and reinvented are going to form the bedrock of our economy moving forward. And I think in particular, when we talk about national competitiveness, my argument is that for this council, it is the spaces that are most important and impactful in climate that are going to form the foundation of our national competitiveness moving forward. And that's because there's going to be multiple trillion-dollar industries that are getting reinvented and created. And those industries are the things that we care most about. Of course, the things that matter most in climate are the things we use the most of, right? Food, water, energy, materials, transportation. And really, I think in all of these dimensions, whether you care about the security side or you care about the climate side, we know that national competitiveness and security both depend on leadership in these industries, and it's across the board. Okay, I'm going to hard right here and say we talk a lot about the problem. We talk a lot about, oh God, here's all the issues, here's where we're going to go. There's a lot of kind of groundswell of here's all the different kinds of solutions, here's what I'm working on that can help, here's what I'm working on that can help. But I actually think we lack a fundamental vision of our climate future, and working back from that vision of a climate future. I'm actually curious, does anyone here in the audience, raise your hand if you have a very clear sense of what it would mean to be successful, like 100 years out, for our actions today around climate? If so, I desperately want to talk to you, like desperately. Here's one attempt. I'm not saying this is right, but here's something to say. I'd like to believe that we'd live in an intentional Anthropocene, where the path that we take from here to there is one that minimizes human suffering and that minimizes the chance of tipping points in the Earth climate system. You can agree or disagree with this, but I do challenge you to say that it's the job of potentially this council and it's the job of leaders across industry to really work from a place of vision of the future we're trying to build towards and working back from that. I think that's fundamentally lacking. And just a quick aside, the path we take to get there really does matter. Here's a few temperature over time for the planet curves. Which world do you want to live in? I very much want to live in the green world. The max temperature that we hit, or the total amount of integrated time we spend above a certain temperature threshold, are radically, radically impactful in terms of the total amount of human suffering, the probability of hitting irreversible tipping points. And so it's nice to say what things look like in 2100 or 2150 or whatever it is, and it's nice to say where things are today. The curve, the shape of that curve matters. It really, really does. And I don't think we talk about path dependency enough. So I'll close really with, in my mind, when we work backwards from a vision of our climate future that we might actually want to attain, we understand and contextualize that path dependency truly matters. I'd argue that there's 5 main playbooks that we need to be collectively building. We need to eliminate our emissions. Let's be clear. Net zero is obligate. We have to be at least there. There's no version of a positive climate future without it. We're going to have to remove emissions in order to get there. There's also no avoiding that at this point, unfortunately. Carbon removal, probably both CO2 as well as methane, potentially nitrous oxide as well. I'm going to say this is probably a bit bold for any audience, but radiative forcing management is obligate. Who cares about GHG emissions other than the acidity of the ocean, which I do care about, but whatever. We care about the radiative forcing, which is really how much energy are we absorbing compared to the energy that's leaving the atmosphere. That's called temperature change. There's ways to modify that. We're going to have to adapt. We know this. Adaptation is coming. I'm least worried about adaptation in the sense that we're very adaptable as a species. We tend to spend money when it benefits us in the next 20 minutes of our life, right? We're going to choose to spend money on adaptation, but the amount it costs to adapt is something that could drive immense changes in outcomes. And so I think there's massive opportunity for innovation in reducing the cost of adaptation that's coming. And then finally, and this is what I think this audience and this council is uniquely positioned to do, it's really about focusing on building the institutions to manage systemic risks and to think about that on timescales that our existing institutions are not actually set up to manage. This is one of the fundamental issues. Climate change is an issue of an externality that we don't value in the economy over time periods that none of us really can immediately find traction with. And we need new fundamental institutions to be able to think about risk in that context. So I'll close with, these are the 4 levers that I care about. They map pretty well, actually, with I think Paul, you presented yesterday. It's nice to know that there's a little bit of convergence in the community there. But I really do believe that innovation is so fundamentally requisite here, and it's across all dimensions. This is the most inclusive work possible, and I'll zoom out back to the top. I do not think that there is a conflict inherent between issues of economic and social and climate justice and issues of long-term climate change. I really do think that these are the work that we must do together in concert in order to actually be building towards a vision of a future 100 years out that we all actually want our children to be living in. So thank you, and thanks for not yelling at me.
Thanks, Cooper. Maybe folks might realize now what I realized when I first spoke with you. It was both very depressing and very enlightening and heartening. So thanks for sharing your vision with us. We're going to close out our innovation spotlight with one last look. This will be the future of education, and we're really lucky to have with us Roy Matthew. Roy is this senior partner and the national practice leader for higher education for Deloitte. So, Roy.
I'm going to use the microphone. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. All right, good morning. Thanks for having me here today. When Chad said I had 8 minutes to talk about education, I said, well, we only need 6 minutes to solve that. What do we do with the other 2 minutes? That's an easy problem to solve. No, I'm kidding. This is a very complex topic. And so I wanted to start off by saying, I think this group knows better than anybody. The United States has one of the best education ecosystems in the world, if not the best. When you look at the research that has come out over the last 50 to 100 years, when you look at the number of families that have established career pathways into the middle class or the upper class because of a college degree or because of education, without a doubt, you can confidently say it is the best educational ecosystem. I am the poster child, or one of the poster children, for the American educational system. I was not born in this country. English is not my first language. I was born in the Middle East. I was a refugee for 2 years during the first Gulf War. We lost everything. But as a family, our North Star was, we got to come to America for a college degree. So that was kind of the North Star for us, and everything else was secondary to that. And I was grateful enough to get degrees from 2 of the finest institutions that this country has to offer. And so it's a privilege to be here in front of all of you today to talk about the topic of the future of education. However, as great as this ecosystem is, it has to make us wonder, a lot of these achievements, trailing indicators for our success and our successes and our achievements from the last 50 years or 100 years. So are we really resting on our laurels for the work that was done over the past century? And what is it going to take for us to make sure that we maintain this position for the next 50 to 100 years and beyond? So that's kind of the context and the framing for this whole thing. And when you double click on this concept of education in this country, there are a couple of macro trends that we all have to be aware of. So yes, education is still the greatest equalizer when it comes to society and uplifting families and communities and societies. However, when you look at the last 5 to 10 years, the faith in education here has dropped more than any other institution that has been measured by Gallup and others. And it's kind of a tough erosion of trust when you realize that the comparison of education and the loss in faith is greater than the loss in faith in the presidency, Congress, big business, and the criminal justice system. What does that say about perception of education? So that's number one. Number two, when you compare the United States to the other countries in the OECD and other kind of developing and developed nations, we have dropped from 2nd to 16th since 2000 in terms of 25 to 34-year-olds who have a bachelor's degree. During that period of time, the other member countries have grown 200% in terms of their population of 25 to 34-year-olds who have actually gotten college degrees and bachelor's degrees. So that's number two. Number three, when you look at the forecast for 2100 and population growth, 5 of the top 10 countries in terms of largest countries in terms of population are in Africa. So we talk a lot about India and China and all, the countries that we're familiar with and work very closely with in terms of education. 5 of those top 10 countries are in Africa. And what are we doing about that? Right? So these are some of the macro trends in terms of the problem statement. So just like any scientist, and I'm a data geek, I've been dealing with this type of data for 25 years, and my mission in life is to bridge the gap between public and private sector to solve these types of problems. And so when you look at are there comparables? So is there another comparable institution or discipline in this country where the United States has been a leader and continues to be a leader on the global stage? What is another discipline that comes to mind? Professional sports. And as a college athlete, this is something that's near and dear to my heart. I know you couldn't tell just by looking at me. But when you actually look at the United States' performance in the Olympics specifically, we have a track record of excellence, and we continue to maintain that track record of excellence despite other countries catching up. And you have to ask yourself, what are the foundational elements that has allowed us to maintain that excellence, and how do we apply that to the construct that we're all talking about? And while this is a multidimensional problem, it comes down to 3 very simple fundamental things that we have done in the sports arena that allows us to remain competitive and dominant in this space. Number 1, a bottom-up feeder system for early identification of talent. So, you don't go to Michael Phelps at 18 years old and say, hey, I saw you swimming. You're a good swimmer. You want to come swim in the Olympics? That's not how that happens. You start off by identifying talent at 3 years old, 5 years old. My daughter plays club volleyball. At 8 years old, she's getting trained by U.S. national team coaches, right, who used to play in the national team, right? So early identification of talent is one of the critical fundamental prerequisites to the U.S. maintaining its dominance in professional sports. Number 2, smart funding. I don't think any of us are talking about, yes, we need more funding, but it's when you compare us to other countries, the volume or the absolute number of funding, that's not the issue. It's smart funding, or are we using the funding wisely? So you look, for those of you who've been to the Olympic training facility in Colorado Springs, compare that to our classrooms, or compare that to the average lab at an R1 university, right? And you say, we're struggling to find $300,000 to buy chemistry lab equipment for a world-renowned professor at an R1, but how do we take care of athletes? Mental health, well-being, training facilities, uniforms, nutrition, coaches, right? That's one of the fundamental reasons why we've been so dominant and successful. And lastly, and this is the hard part, but for in the sports arena, we figure this out. It's that sense of pride and achievement. It's that culture where we celebrate athletes. If we have an Olympic athlete in our community, we say, hey, I'm neighbors with that person who went to the Olympics. If we have somebody who lives in our zip code, hey, that Olympic athlete lives in our zip code. We put them on Wheaties boxes. When's the last time you saw a PhD in physics on a Wheaties box? Right? We don't do that. We don't celebrate that, right? So if you think about these three fundamental things in terms of how we have maintained that dominance, now if you apply that to the conversation we're all talking about in our world, number one, the bottom-up feeder system for early identification of talent and how do you nurture and curate them. This whole concept of K through 12 plus 2. How do we make sure that you don't have to go through a 4-year experience and you can actually have credentials or stackable credentials over a 6-month period or 8-month period in cybersecurity or artificial intelligence or analytics or automation or blockchain and get them connected to the private sector and get them into a job or get them experience in a national lab? Do you really need to spend 4 more years? It would be great if they could do that, but how do we make sure that we can actually use these new modalities of learning and technology to identify that talent early and put them through the system in the way that we do athletes? That's number one. Number two, smart funding. Imagine if we funded our schools and colleges at the same level that we fund our facilities in Colorado Springs and every other athletic facility that we have in our country, in our neighborhoods, that allow these students and these children to grow up and thrive in their sport. It's the same analogy. So there's smart funding. It's not more funding. More funding would help, but more smart funding would help. And lastly, it's that changing of culture from an education perspective where we celebrate education, where we celebrate research. When the conversation at Thanksgiving changes from, are you going to college, to where are you going to college, we figured it out. That's the game changer right there. So we have to make sure that as communities and as a society, we acknowledge and respect and admire folks who actually have figured out mRNA, which has allowed us to create the COVID-19 vaccine. If you ask the average teenager, who are the 2 scientists that came up with the COVID-19 vaccine, I bet most of them couldn't answer that. If you ask them who has the best 3-point shooting percentage in the NBA, most kids are going to say Steph Curry. Right? It's a known fact. So how do we make sure that this is part of our dialogue and it's something we celebrate? And that's the hardest part. If we can figure that part out, we're well on our way to success. So everything that we're talking about, this is not like it's a problem we haven't solved before. It's not an unknown. Today and yesterday, we've talked about a lot of unknowns. This is something that we as a country have solved in a different discipline. We just need to apply those principles to this. It's hard, don't get me wrong. It is extremely hard. But this group of leaders and this council, with the advocacy and the platforms that we have, we can definitely do it because there is a primer for success where we have done this before and continue to do this over a century. And we continue to maintain that excellence. It's a matter of replicating that and customizing that for our world. Thank you so much for the audience.
Roy, thanks so much for challenging us, for pointing out the opportunity we have ahead of us, and we're going to take your words to heart. And we've already sent a note to our Vice Chair, Janet Foudy from Deloitte, who introduced us to Roy to thank you for your contributions. So a couple of housekeeping notes. We're going to make the big transition here. This was the end of our major plenaries for this 2-day summit. So first, I just want to thank everyone for sticking with us and for being a part of the conversation. We're going to take a little break, 15 or 20 minutes, and then we're going to go back to our breakout groups. Same rooms as yesterday. You'll have around 2 hours for a conversation, but I want to just remind folks one important thing about these breakout groups. We came to Davis for a purpose. That purpose was to begin a continuing conversation. So our ask of you today, as you wind down that conversation, share additional ideas with our moderators and our rapporteurs, is to also consider remaining on the journey with the council team. These breakout groups will continue to meet over the coming 8 to 9 months, most likely virtually, with 1 to 2 to 3 online sessions for each working group, this summer, early fall. That will help us back in DC and the team and with our national commissioners to build that next big report that we hope to debut in December at our National Competitiveness Forum. There are many people who could not be here with us at Davis who will be joining those groups going forward. So you'll have the chance to engage with even other colleagues from across the country in these areas of interest. So keep that in mind today. We'll hope you'll have enjoyed the time here at Davis, but you'll stay with us going forward. Also, as you transition, have a little bit of a break, get to your rooms around 11:10. There will be lunch outside, buffet style. Enjoy your lunch. Feel free to take it with you to your working group. It's a working session, working lunch. Davis has been very kind and generous in providing us with yet another great meal today. At the end of your breakout groups, teams from the council and UC Davis will come to your rooms and help you to gather for the concluding part of the day, which is a set of innovation tours on campus. I know it's a little rainy today, but we've got 2 great options. You can learn more about your options in the event electronic book that you either should have on your phone or your computer, but you can also find on the QR code. So take a look, see which tour you want to take, and the team here will help you find a shuttle at around 1:15 or so. I may be off by a few minutes, but Yasmin and the team will make sure everyone's gathered, and you'll have the opportunity to spend an hour and a half or 2 hours on the campus at Davis exploring all sorts of awesome opportunities. And then the shuttles will bring everyone back here. We'll have a concluding set of remarks from Deborah, our president and CEO of the council, and Chancellor May. So enjoy a little bit of a break. By 11:10 or so, find your way back to your workout groups, and then from there, we'll see you on the tours. Thanks so much.